Hi, everybody. Welcome so much to this month's member webinar for Optionality. Optionality, as you may know, is a community for people who are exploring, executing on, or trying to continuously improve their optionality driven life. And today we are joined by Dr. Natalie Nixon. We've had her on before with her previous book, The Creativity Leap. And now we're talking to her about her current book, Move, Think, Rest. And I have the book right here, and I want to read the subhead because I love it. Redefining productivity and a relationship with time. And I have so many questions for Natalie. I know we're going to have an amazing conversation. So Natalie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this talk.
Before we jump into Move, Think, Rest, there were a couple of terms you used in the book that I wanted sort of as a glossary to understand your thinking around. And the first is that we have a member, Marie Gill, who talks a lot about flourishing, which you mention in your book. And you distinguish it from thriving, which I think I probably have usually thought of as pretty similar. And I thought your distinction was interesting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I was really building on an astute op-ed that Adam Grant wrote in the New York Times. I guess in 2021, we were just kind of like normalizing ourselves during the COVID pandemic. And he really was writing about how thriving was kind of the antithesis to languishing, which a lot of us were experiencing that feeling of just kind of lingering, languishing, a different type of liminal state that I know you and I will get into a little bit later. And thriving to me it has a bit more urgency. It can be a bit more one directional, I'm a big fan of etymology. And so when I was wrestling with, like, why did that not quite complete the picture for me? And I started thinking about the word flourishing. When you look up the etymology for flourish, it's rooted in the word floor, floral, and flowering. And so the way not all, but some plants flowers, they have this ability to go to contract into bud form and then to expand back out. And so that visual was something to me that really captures the ways that we might better uh, better approach our work and the development of our lives, to think of it in terms of flourishing, to think of it in terms of phases and beginnings and ends, and to be able to bloom out. But also there are times when we have to retreat into bud form. And so that's why I really appreciate the way I'm distinguishing flourishing versus thriving.
Yeah, you make me think about how some plants are seasonal, some are perennial, some, that we don't all flourish the same.
We don't. We don't.
And
And that's okay.
and that's okay. Yes, exactly. The other word pair, do you
Oh,
happen to know?
excuse me, Lisa. Not only is it okay, it's like necessary for biodiversity, right?
Oh, yes. Good point. Good point. It's so funny. I was watching, my husband and I are doing this complete Star Trek watch through, and we're on the series Star Trek Enterprise, which came out in the early 2000s and which is kind of the bastard stepchild of the Star Trek. Most people don't like it. It lasted fewer seasons. But I actually recorded a little speech that Captain Archer, Scott Bakula, made about to the Vulcans about diversity, and saying that how enlightened can you be if you cannot learn to celebrate and get along with people who are different from yourself, and it's a little longer than that. But I was like, oh, I recorded it. And I'm like, I have to like do something with that because I'm like,
Yeah.
20 years ago, we knew that. like,
Yeah. Yeah. The
um,
multiple gems that come from Star Trek.
yes. I'm wondering, you may not know, do you know the etymology of the word thrive? I'm just curious.
I don't know.
No, I'll have to look that up afterwards. The other word pair that I was interested in was the concept of being adaptive versus reactive. Both imply you are in a give and take with your environment and that context matters. So, how do you distinguish? Because I think there is a general, oh, being adaptive, good, being reactive, bad. So, how can we distinguish between those two and try to be more adaptive versus reactive?
Yeah, you're right. There is kind of this judgment call that even I make in my head about being reactionary, reactive versus adaptive. And I was leaning more into the value of being adaptive. So the way I think about being reactionary and reactive is that it's a bit more one directional. It's not typically sustainable. It's for a specific reason. Even in chemistry, a reactive agent is there to land the two compounds into a different future state. Being reactionary also feels a bit more copy paste
Mm,
or cut paste to me. And the way I think about being adaptive is that being adaptive means we're situational, which means we have to be much more observant and aware of the environment. It means that we are giving ourselves time to zoom out, to factor in all the variables that we need to make a decision about which way is next. And for me, that role of pausing is really central to being adaptive versus being reactionary, which feels a bit like quick and but more of a thrust. And there's time and place for that. Um, so let me give you an example from a very newfound avocation of mine, which is open water swimming. There are times when you're swimming in the open water where you must be reactive, right? So if you're constantly sighting, you're constantly being aware of your swimming buddies. I don't do open water swimming by myself, so I'm always in a small group. There's usually a boat or a kayaker kind of on the side somewhere. So when I'm sighting, I feel like I'm being adaptive to the environment. I must constantly be adaptive to the changing currents. There's just this sentient intelligence and awareness to help me adapt to all of the morphing that's happening. I have to be reactionary if one of my fellow swimmers does a signal that means that I mean, actually, this has never happened where someone's well, some people some open water swimmers brag that they like saw a barracuda. Like I actually have never seen one, but maybe that's why I continue to do open water swimming because people are like, "Aren't you afraid of sharks?" But I haven't experienced that yet. But you want to be reactionary to, sudden dangers. You're not in the natural environment of humans. So, and there are some natural dangers that you have to be aware of. But that might be another context for me to explain how I think about being reactionary versus being adaptive.
I do think that reactive kind of implies a like one, 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 something happens, you react, and it's like almost transactional. Whereas adaptive feels like you're in a flow, more of a flow
Yeah.
state of, you know,
It's emergent. Being adaptive feels a bit more like emergence
the
to me.
reaction ends, the thing
Yes,
happens, you react, where the adaptation continues.
it morphs. Yes.
Yes, and is constantly changing. Okay, well, thanks for doing that because I thought those were both really interesting distinctions that maybe I'd never really thought my way through, and it was helpful when I was reading the book. So let's dig into this move, think, rest, the concept, the framework. Just give me an overview of how you came up with this concept. And I think what is so interesting about your framework is that these are not separate things; you see them as intertwined. So give us the move, think, rest overview to get us started.
So move, think, rest is a provocative. Book is in a lot of ways is a provocation. It is a human-centered operating system to help us flourish as individuals, as teams, and as organizations. And I wrote the book based on my own personal experience with a burnout moment when I was in academia, as well as when I used to consult. I don't consult anymore, but I was observing a lot more regularly people kind of dying a slow death at work. And as a creativity strategist, the goal and the hope of my work is to help people understand that creativity is not a nice to have, it's a must have. It is the engine for innovation, and it is part of our birthright as humans to be creative. It's not something that only artists or designers are great at, but the best engineers, scientists, CFOs, farmers, teachers, plumbers are super creative. So, so that's kind of the background. That was kind of all that was just emerged. This was why I was still writing and the creativity leap and then doing a lot of speaking related to the creativity leap. I was still observing this. I was also noticing that once I shifted away from being a professor, I was a professor for 16 years, retired from academia, did not look back, was learning a new muscle and skill set to become an entrepreneur. As a solopreneur, I have a small team. Um, I have to I have to practice a lot of different hacks and ways to stay focused, to stay energized, to build momentum, to be cognizant of my mindset. This is big mindset work when you are an entrepreneur. And I started noticing that on the times when I thought I was procrastinating and like, shame on me, I stepped away to take out dishes, empty the dishwasher, go for a 10-minute walk, or daydream. I also noticed, I wasn't sure if it was correlative, causal, that when I came back to the work at hand, my thinking was sharper. I was more energized. The ideas were just more synchronous and flowing. And so it was this personal observation. It was this external observation, acknowledgement that people were really struggling with building creativity as a competency and as a capacity. So in my portfolio of work at Figure Eight Thinking, at the apex, kind of the umbrella, is this theory I developed called the wonder rigor theory, which is this idea that creativity is our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems, deliver novel value, and discern meaning. And so all of my nerdy frameworks and ways to help people work more meaningfully and constructively are these on ramps to build creativity as a capacity, whether it's the three I's, which is inquiry, improv, and intuition, or the LEAP method, or now the motor framework, the move, think, rest framework. So, movement, thought, and rest is this framework, once again, to help you and your team build creativity as a competency, as a capacity. So, the movement part of the motive memory. And thank you for highlighting that it is not sequential, it's not siloed, it is situational, it's integrative. The movement part, think of it in terms of movement hygiene. I know that we all know that it's important to exercise, but that's not really what I was focusing in on the
Yeah.
movement area. It was much more about how can we make sure we're integrating movement and throughout the day, which is what I mean by movement hygiene. Are we making sure that we are interspersing sitting with standing? Do we have a standing desk? I have right here this contraption that I put on top of my desk where I can lower it to sit or I can raise it if I want to stand. Are we making sure that we are designing moments to walk? And that's because as humans, we are designed to move. We're not designed to be oblongata and at the base of the brain. If we sit cramped up all day, we will constrict blood flow to the brain, which means we constrict oxygen, which means we actually will not do our best thinking, our best work. So that's movement. The thought piece is not only focused on rational, cognitive, sharp thinking. I was really interested in exploring the value of backcasting and forecasting. So, backcasting in thought is the role of reflection, the role of memory, the role of metacognition. Why do I think the way I think? Which most of us do not have much time to do during the day, which I assert is a bit problematic. And then forecasting is about dreaming, daydreaming, imagination, and then the moment in between the present state is about curiosity and inspiration. So the reason that matters is that if we want to have sharper, clearer, rational thought, which is very much about convergent thinking, we have to design space and time for that much more divergent thinking, which is where the default mode network in the brain sets in and different neural synapses get activated for us to do our best work. Then the rest part, I was interested in the message of this book is not for corporations to put in a nap room. I mean, right on if that makes sense for your corporate culture, but I was really thinking about scaling rest. So I explore, taking micro breaks, taking daydream breaks, and that right there is an example of the integration between thought and rest. But also scaling it in terms of what does long-term rest look like? What's the role of sabbatical? So I interviewed for the whole book, I interviewed almost 60 people, but I interviewed people who've done sabbaticals who work at nonprofits, people who work at big tech firms who've done sabbatical. Clearly, in academia, sabbatical is something you're rewarded for after, 7 years, typically. Um, the challenge, though, with sabbatical is that people aren't always taking advantage of it, in part because it's not modeled, in part because uh, there's fear that there'll be punitive slap on the wrist if they actually do take the sabbatical. However, all of the motive framework is really about this macro management way of leading and managing versus micromanagement, and that the base of macro management is trust that
Mm.
people will do the work that they need to get done. And I probably should have started here. The big reason that I ended up writing the book, in addition to my personal burnout moment, observing other people burning out, what the research is showing about burnout, is that are three drivers. Unprecedented burnout. So some research studies showed that up to 75% of employees are self-reporting experiencing burnout. That's a business cost, and we can talk about that later. So unprecedented burnout, ubiquitous technology, which means we can work differently, and new rules for remote work. So the motor framework is couched in a model of cultivation. And I propose that we put productivity to bed because it's a relic of the first industrial revolution.
Mm.
The ways that productivity is focused on speed, efficiency, outputs. We only measure what we can see. And the challenge is that GDP today is not even factoring into the main ways we get work done. GDP today does not factor in search engines. It does not factor in email. So there's this kind of invisible layer of work, of modes of work that creates this friction. So the cultivation model that I propose is saying that instead of asking how might we be more productive this quarter, we might be asking what might we cultivate. So cultivation values the solo practitioner and the collective. It values quick spurts of growth and slow. And it values that we measure what we can see, what's happening visibly, but it also acknowledges that there's a lot going on during dormant phases when we just need things to percolate and we need to sleep on it. So that's the framework in a nutshell.
Yeah, my spouse is a programmer and always used to say that so much of the work they did was thinking, you know, that wasn't typing. Programming isn't typing 100%. It's like trying to solve the problem through thinking it through. You reminded me, I have so many thoughts after all of that, but Jory and I had a conversation for our last conversationality, and we were talking about rest and joy and all these things that we're optionality has been talking about over our analog summer. And I brought up a story, and I'm just going to repeat it because I'm curious your thoughts. When I was a kid, um, once my dad married my mom, he got his citizenship and he brought over his whole family, the grandparents and seven siblings, adults, and so every Sunday we went to my grandparents' house, and the kids were left to their own devices pretty much. The adults were doing their thing. And we would drive home every Sunday night and we would all be a bit tired and worn out. Nobody was really, we were all resting our, minds really from all that interaction and kind of intense. I had like 20 cousins, there was a lot of people, right? And I remember staring, it would be nighttime. I would be staring out the window of the car, and it was probably only like a 25-minute drive, but it felt long. It felt like a journey. And I would daydream, And some years ago, I started noticing that every minivan, every SUV had screens in the back seat for the kids to watch an animated film. And I get it why that would be very, very appealing. But I wondered to myself, and I've wondered ever since, when do kids daydream? When do they just stare out a window and daydream? Because even I think also with the ubiquity of having phones, once you get to a certain age, I mean, you don't have to daydream because you can see what your friends are up to all over everywhere, online. And what do you think? What do you think about lower opportunities for daydreaming going back to when we're young? Like, how do you think that kind of impacts our brains? Or does it? Or do we find ways to exercise our brains in that way, other ways?
So The opportunity with all of this technology that we're not quite leveraging is that because we can get to answers more quickly, it opens us up for space. It opens up time for spaciousness. It opens up time to have eyeball to eyeball conversations, to do more critical thinking, to do more reflection. But we are not viewing it in that way yet because we have a tech crush, we have a busyness addiction, and it's all still very new. But what to me, what all this technology really affords us is that we're in the middle of a human revolution, not a tech revolution. And I agree with you that I think even 20 years ago when Facebook first came out, a lot of thought leaders in the tech space, or maybe just in the society critique of society space, where we're saying, we are in the middle of a really interesting experiment. We have no idea how this will change the way the brain functions. And so when we daydream, that's one of the many default ways that we go into the default mode network of the brain. And the default mode network, I interviewed Ivy Ross, who is the head of design at Google for this, but she's also co-author with Susan Magsamen of Your Brain on Art. It's so important to have activity where we drop out of the world and tap in more inwardly, because different neurosynapses in the brain, different regions of the brain are able to really fire up, unbeknownst to us, really do the deep synthesis work that means that when we return to the work at hand, we have the light bulb moment. So default mode network comes into play when we are going for a walk in nature, or from the Japanese, forest bathing, when we daydream, when we have a nice deep rest, even when we have a shower moment where we don't have to consciously think about washing ourselves, and the mind can just do wandering. So psychologists, they don't use the word daydream, they call it mind wandering. So mind wandering is an essential part of helping the brain go to the default mode network. And that's really important because it actually is where all the juicy bits of ideation come about, so that we can do much more innovative thinking. And overall, the default mode network is where we really drop into liminal space. And I am fascinated by liminal space because I actually like ambiguity. Now, in the book, I distinguish between anxiety provoking ambiguity, like there's been forest fires, we don't have a home, where do we go?
Right.
Right? There's that type of ambiguity, which is not fun. But then there is kind of a restorative ambiguity that I think we tend to run away from. But the ambiguity that is restorative, even the parts of ambiguity in our lives that have been a little scary, like I don't know what my next step is. What will I do next? If you reflect back on your life, it's those moments of liminality where you're on the verge of, you're at that chasm of a lot of gray, that requires you to do some back casting, to ask for help, to draw upon the skills you've developed, to tap into your intuition, in order to figure out what the next steps are. So great observation about children not having it more space designed to just be, even to get bored, right? I
Mm,
share a reflection about, for me and my sister growing up, we learned really quickly not to go to our mom and say, Mommy, I'm bored, because she would say, only boring people get bored. So we'd be like, hang on, I guess I don't want to do that. So you figure it out. Like you figure out how to, like you said, entertain yourselves and
right.
dream or play in the dirt. So yeah.
Everything you say makes me think of 10 things I want to talk to you about, but let's stick with the liminality thing because I only think I learned the word liminal fairly recently. I think my friend Brady Hahn was publishing an issue of her zine, and the theme was liminality. And I was writing something for it. And I was like, oh, like this was maybe 5 years ago. Um, I think you articulated liminality as being this space in between, this space of ambiguity, and being in a liminal state. But you also in the book talk about liminality almost sort of physically, like the liminality when you're about to fall asleep, when you're about to wake up. And you have this anecdote about how, was it Einstein who used to, was it Einstein? I'm
It was the light bulb guy, Edison.
Edison. Sorry, I knew it was an E scientist. Edison used to hold to this. This is crazy. Is this apocryphal or like real that he would hold balls so that when he was about to fall asleep, he would drop the balls and it would wake him up, and he would try to write down what he was thinking? Is that's like a real documented thing? Because I'm like,
According to the research, I hired a research assistant to write this book, help me with the secondary research. I did the primary
yeah,
qualitative research. So this is something new that I learned. So it's these two somewhat confusing sounding words, but here's how I keep them straight in my head. So one word is hypnopompic, and the other word is hypnagogic. So the hypnagogic state, think of gogic and groggy. So as you're starting to fall asleep, so he would hold an orb and he'd lie down on a sofa or a chaise and have an orb, something heavy in his hand. As he was going into the hypnagogic state of starting to fall asleep, the orb would drop, it would startle him. And because he would notice that when he had naturally done that, there would be these ideas that would just kind of synchronize, or a new thought would emerge to me. He thought, that's kind of helpful. How can I hack the
yeah,
hypnagogic state, right? So he did that through holding a ball. The hypnopompic state, so think of pomp as like pop, you are waking up, right? We as a collective of humans, we tend to experience the hypnopompic state more regularly. And that happens, for example, so you had a nice, great deep rest, and you're slowly beginning to wake up, and you something that you were stuck on the other day or the night before, you get the inspired idea, right? So hypnagogic, drifting into sleep, hypnopompic as you are emerging from
yeah.
sleep. In both of these states, the research, the neuroscience research is showing that we have our most creative ideas. And what is creativity? I think about as talking between wonder and rigor. Creativity is really about the juxtaposition, the remix, the mashup of different things that we would formerly have never put together, right? And
Yeah.
so what a lot of neuroscientists and advocates of getting into that liminal space say you might do is, if there is a conundrum that you're stuck on, seed the question in your head before you drift off to sleep, right? If there's something that you're thinking about, you want to try to understand, plant the seed in your head while you're still not conscious, rational state, and let the default mode network go to work. Let those different neural synapses go to work. Because the default mode network, not the scientific language, it's just my language. I call it the washing machine for the brain.
Mm.
And when it helps to massage these different ideas, that actually is when we get to the interesting mashup and juxtaposition that we can't get at when you're just in a meeting to a meeting to a meeting, or
Yeah.
you're just staring at the document. You've got to have ways to zoom out. Daydreaming is a way to do that. Rest is a way to do that. Engaging in a fun, silly conversation, reading fiction. These are all ways to tap out of the world and drop into your body subconsciously.
It's interesting to me to wonder how the phrase "I'll sleep on it." How did that come in? There was some intuitive like understanding that of what you're
Well,
talking about as neuroscience.
Well,
Well,
the phrase I'll sleep on it, the phrase my gut is telling me, like I love that now that we know about the vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve in the body that goes from the brain down through the heart and the lungs into the gut. The vagus nerve is this complex neural system that is the channel for intuition. It is the highway through which interoception, not intro, but interoception happens. So two other interesting words that I learned in the research of this book. So proprioception is our awareness of where we are in space. So dancers are really good at proprioception. Birds are outstanding at proprioception. You've seen a bird like fly right through a tree and nail landing on a branch through all this bramble. That's incredible proprioception. Interoception is how I'm sensing myself. Do I feel safe? Do I feel in danger? Do I feel hungry? Do I feel tired? Do I feel hot? Do I feel cold? That's all interoception. And it's all powered by the vagus nerve. So when we say things like, my gut is telling me, it literally is. So it is really cool how we craft language
hmm.
to make sense of these the sentient awareness in our body.
I was super interested in the gut part of the conversation because Um, I'm here in Silicon Valley, and like when I think about your first book, The Creativity Leap and Wonder and Rigor, I can see exactly how like the typical Silicon Valley hustle and grind mindset they would adapt your message there to fit what they already think about grinding and hustling. I think they'll have a little more trouble with the thinking and resting and all of that. But one thing I thought when I was reading the gut section is that in an environment where people are doing a lot of pattern matching, and pattern matching is a polite way of saying acting with bias in my world here in Silicon Valley. How do you prevent your gut? I often say interrogate your gut rather than trust your gut. Interrogate it, like acknowledge it's there, but then ask yourself what else could be contributing to this? How do you prevent your gut from actually reflecting bias or pattern matching that is in fact exclusionary?
See, I don't quite think of it in that way. I actually think that the gut is typically counterculture. So culture is really what tends to build in a lot of bias, right? Culture is the way we do things around here. And if I want to fit in, so for example, if you are not a member of the majority culture, you very quickly become bilingual, you very quickly become aware of the different sets of rules, and you become very agile in navigating and boundary spanning and those ways. When we have intuitive moments, sometimes we do too much interrogation, which means we don't strengthen that sonar, that muscle that is intuition. Intuition, in a lot of people's experience, typically is the opposite of what people say you should do. It's that nudge, it's that knowing without knowing. You can't back it up with data, you can't back it up with some kind of Excel sheet. It is something that is telling you, and it's just this feeling. And so, how do you get better at following intuition? Well, you do your own data collection. You retrospectively factor in how did it work out in those times when I ignored my intuition. What were the results? And how to work out those times when I made that leap and I did follow my intuition. So I actually think intuition often is a signal to help us um, be more self-reflective and maybe counterculture. The other thing I learned in the research for this book is that more of the neuroscience research on intuition is drawing a solid bold line between intuition and rational strategic decision making. So for all the Silicon Valley companies that may not defer to the humanistic approach to work in light of technology, a lot of science has news for them, right? And especially in a time when technology is doing basic tasks, the opportunity is to use that technology as a leverage of all the things that make us uniquely human. So one bit of research that I learned about, the research experiment was to have people seated with their feet on the ground, their hands on their lap, and they were asked to tap out the rhythm of their heart, not by feeling their pulse. Some people are horrible at it. They're like, what do you like? What? I can't do that. And other people are like, yeah, uh-huh, okay. And they're still and they can feel the rhythm of their heartbeat. That's called interoceptive awareness. And then they also measured how accurate it is. That's called interoceptive accuracy. They then did some other part of the experiment where they learned that there is a connection between people who have high interoceptive awareness, this high uh, connection and discernment of where they're at, how they're feeling, and rational cognitive decision making. So I just think it's fascinating that we are in a zeitgeist moment where we simultaneously have this, I call it a tech crush. We were infatuated with the technology slash terrified of it. But also in the zeitgeist, there's all this trend towards human consciousness, meditation, intuition. And that's not by accident. It actually makes sense to me that we're in a moment in Western society, not around the world, but in Western society, of trying to reconcile the two. So I think you can hang off your fingernails to hang on to kind of old ways of doing, or or suspend judgment and lean into what are the possibilities that we could explore about how we build more human-centered organizations, more human-centered ways of working because of the technology and what it can free up for us.
Hmm. Well, there's a lot there. And I was just trying to imagine that exercise of being able to know what my heartbeat. I think I would be one of those people who's not good at it.
Yeah, I'm not good at it. It's hard. But if you go into a really still place, it's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. I'll
Sometimes you
have
can
to
tap
try
into
that.
it.
So we started the month. I spoke with Shireen Etessam about play. We did an excerpt from her book, and we had a conversation about play. And her definition of play was maybe a little different than some of our members. You know, they commented, "Oh, you're kind of broadening or widening the definition of
But what it,
play."
I did talk to Sharon, but how, remind, how does she
Well,
define
no,
play?
she's talking about play as being a place where you're in a flow state. It doesn't have to be a game. It doesn't have to be, you can play at work. You can play. It's about the nature of engagement. And it can be non-traditional what you think of when you're playing. It can be different than that. And I felt somewhat the same. I wanted to ask you the same question about how do you define rest? Because I think most of us, if I'm resting, I am sitting, I am leaning back, maybe I'm closing my eyes, maybe I'm inactive. And I don't think that's your definition of rest. That it's a little broader than that. So how do you define rest?
So I define rest as utilizing space and time to slow down and go inward. Sometimes it's only about going inward. Sometimes it's slowing down and going inward. So for example, I actually enter a restful state when I am swimming laps, for example. And part of the reason that's happening is I've never been a fan of meditation. I don't feel like I'm very good at it until I learned that there's something called kinesthetic meditation. So there is a meditative state that you can get into through movement. I think knitters, people crochet can kind of do a kinesthetic
Yeah.
meditation, doodlers as well, right? So for me, I get into that ability to utilize time and space to slow down and go inward when I'm actually in motion. And something like swimming has this effect of simultaneously calming me down and energizing me. It also, what I know now to be true is that also because I might just be just zoning out or I might be counting laps. It's the default mode network that's kicking in. But that's how I think about rest.
While I was reading your book, I walk every morning. I go for a loop, anywhere from 1.5 to 2.25 miles. So it's not really super long. It's under an hour, but I do it pretty much every morning. And I've read all the things about habit. So my reward is I stop at the end of my walk and I get my coffee. I don't make coffee at home. If I want coffee, I have to go on a walk. So like that's that aspect of engineering your life for things you want to do. So I want to walk because it's good exercise and I want to get coffee. But so yesterday I tried, I've heard about meditative walking, which I guess is kinesthetic, the kinesthetic version.
Meditation.
And and I even wanted to add it to my habit stack that maybe a couple times a week I would, excuse me, I would do that. But I haven't really done it. But yesterday I'm like, oh, I was reading your book, maybe yesterday or the day before, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna not listen to an audiobook, not listen to a podcast, not make a phone call, which is the other thing that those are the three things. I'm doing one of them when I walk. I put on some not music without lyrics, like a, sort of piano music, very soft as well, because I wanted to like have situational awareness. And I was in the middle of writing a report for a client and I knew I had to finish it. And so I thought, let me not think specifically about it, but let me just think about my experience meeting with them and let me listen to this slight music and just think and walk and have a little bit of music. And anyway, I finished the report this morning and it was like it was
Yay.
helpful. It kind of reoriented instead of thinking about it in a really linear way, I was just sort of reliving the experience of the meetings that we had. Um, and so that was like, thanks to reading your book, because I was like, I'm just going to try something different. And,
Yeah.
it was nice. It was, I don't know, it felt very holistic, to
Yes.
put that all together.
Yeah, you're tapping into the yin, the yang, the contract, release, the natural systems around us within our body, on the earth, in the sea. We get the same signals to contract, release, and we tend to just contract, contract, contract,
Yeah.
contract, and there's never any release. And so there actually will never be flow. And one of the things I read about in the book is the value of kind of like micro retreats, because I was very conscientious in writing this book that it not, I was thinking to myself, is this a privilege type of thing I'm talking about? Is this something that's a luxury? And so I interviewed people who are living with physical disability. I factored in people who or living in a socioeconomic environment where it's not practical or smart to go out for a jog at 7 in the morning or at
Hmm.
6:30 at night. What does movement, thought, and rest mean in those contexts? And it turns out that we can actually learn more from people who have those restrictions in their environments, or in their abilities, to do that. But in a one type of micro retreat is to go on a noticing walk. What I mean by that is to go on a walk in your own neighborhood, maybe in a different neighborhood, where you just observe and notice. Sometimes my walks, I realize that um, we in the West tend to we underutilize our sense of smell. We kind of utilize our sense of sound. We're hyper visual and verbal. Um, so I just go on listening walks. In the summer, it's a wonderful time to do that. So all the layers of sound that I'm hearing. And so it's often really helpful to not focus on the task on hand at all, because it then leads to pattern interruption, right?
Hmm.
Because when we're fixated on this report that we have to write, and we know and the order and sequence of events and how we want to give our case, and we need to interrupt that pattern of thinking. And so those sorts of walks are really great.
I have a book. It's in my next to be read that actually this client, one of their people suggested it. It's called On Looking. And
Mm.
it's a woman who lives in Brooklyn, I think. And she went on her same neighborhood walk a dozen different times, each time with someone who was an expert on something different. One, it was wildlife. One, it was architecture. One, it was urban planning. One, it was, and so I can't wait to read it because she basically goes on this walk and notices um, when you're in the company of someone who knows something you don't, then can point out things you would never notice, and how her own single walk had so many different layers to it. So
I'm
much.
gonna read that. That's
Yeah.
awesome. I love that. I just want to build on something that you touched upon of like, what's the so what of this book to people working in a corporate environment, working in organizations. And so because you've read the majority of the book, that each chapter ends with reflection questions and
Yeah.
exercises for individuals, for teams and organizations. The so what is actually a lot to do with this reality of noticing.
Mm.
If we do not structure and design our work organizations in ways that allow employees to process what they've been meeting about, to do what in design thinking we call lateral thinking, to tap out and go into a totally different environment, and then to observe the way they do things over here and how does it relate to what I do over here, by giving more breaks, by allowing time for reflection, by developing different sorts of KPIs that are additive. I'm not saying, you know, don't measure market share. I'm not saying that. That's an important pulse of how we are doing as a business. I'm also saying that organizations are organisms because they're made up of humans. And because of this time that we are in, of ubiquitous technology, unprecedented burnout, and new rules for remote work, we have an opportunity to add in different types of metrics to identify growth. So one new KPI might be to integrate more experimentation and prototypes, to incentivize it, to then do before and after metrics of what sorts of levels of innovation we get to, when we run this sets of experiments for 1 quarter or for 2 quarters, to do experiments with play and recess. So I interviewed Brendan Boyle, who's a he's a toy designer, game designer, and he teaches a course on play at Stanford D School. So I went out to Stanford, visited his class, interviewed him. He talks about how play is engagement. The opposite of play is boredom. You don't want bored employees because that is a business cost. That leads to
Mhm.
disengagement. That leads to recidivism. That leads to less innovation. When you are part of a legacy sector, a legacy organization, you have to be super nervous when you look into the rearview mirror and there's no one behind you. Because rest assured, there are younger, hungrier upstarts who are figuring something out very differently than you. So you have to build in ways for your organization, for your teams to do this movement, thought, and rest because there is a business case to be made for it.
Well, I love that about your book, that every chapter ends with these reflections and exercises and questions for the self, for your team, and for your organization overall, because it speaks to me about how even individual contributors can contribute to having a more creative workplace. Even if you're a consultant or a solopreneur, you are still, you can infuse how you're working with your clients in the same way. I felt it gave it so much. Also, choose your own adventure. Like, there was so much meat there in the ending of each chapter to help you think about how you conduct. If I go facilitate workshops with clients to help them develop, different strategies, how am I conducting that? In those moments when I'm there, I have a lot of contribution I can make to how they're thinking about a problem and how they're acting on it. Even though I'm a solo person, I'm not, at the end of the day, I'm not making the decision, I'm not executing on the decision, but still in that moment, I really felt like your book gave me a really meaty way to think about how I engage with clients, with members, with, everyone. In
Oh, that's
addition to,
awesome. I'm really happy to
yeah,
hear that.
in addition to how I engage with myself, right? Like, you
Yes,
you
yes.
had this whole the five whys about digging deeper. I've done things like that before, like, why aren't I making myself a healthy dinner every night? Why? Well, I get home so late and I'm so tired. Why? Well, because I feel like I have to stay till, when I used to have a long commute. And it really changed how I architected my day. If I decided that my priority was to make myself a healthy dinner, I had to architect my day differently because I wasn't going to do it through discipline, right? I was going to do it through planning my day differently. And
And think about where the five whys comes from. It comes from Mr. Toyota, not Toyota. He's the founder of Toyota, the automotive company. I'm sorry, I apologize, I botched up his last name. But here's an engineer at an automotive company who engage in inquiry, self-inquiry,
yeah,
reflexivity, curiosity, right? That's such a meta example of everything that I'm talking about, why this matters in these corporate work environments. Like it's not just about like boring through. That's not where
yeah,
the innovation comes from. It comes from the pausing and that process that then is, now global. But that's through that company and a car company
yeah.
that got us to this very self-reflexive mode of inquiry.
You cannot, I just always think that everything I've ever wanted to really change, it wasn't just going to be discipline of saying I want to change it and then I magically will change it. I have to unpack, why am I not changing? I say I want this. Why am I not doing it? Well, there's reasons, I'm a rational human being who has context of a life. There are reasons. And I have to
Yes,
know what those reasons are if I want to mitigate any
yes,
barriers, and it's
yes.
a really thoughtful process to do that. Um, I could go on talking to you about this forever. I really found it to be just a fascinating book. But as I was saying, at the end of each chapter, there was a way to like put it into practice and think about it for yourself, for your team, for your organization. I loved the structure of it. And I loved the concept of it because I think this is the future, no matter what kind of backlash we're getting right now around remote work and command and control that some people really don't want to let go of. New generations are going to come in the workforce and they're going to be like, well, think again. So
Yeah.
I really believe getting on top of this is what will help you lead a multi-generational workforce for the next 10, 20, 30 years. It's important. So how can people, again, the book right here, and of course in your background, but Move, Think, Rest. It's officially out next week, but I saw that bookshop.org, you could order it right now, I think.
Yeah, it's out September 2nd. You can order it through Bookshop,
Everywhere.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Porchlight. The Audible version will be out on September 2nd. I
Oh,
did read the Audible version.
oh,
Uh,
good.
and yeah, people can learn more by going to figure8thinking.com. And I just appreciate the curiosity, the interest, and the support. Thank you
Of
very, very
course.
much.
And that's figure eight, the numeral eight of the
Yes.
word, figure8thinking.com. That's where you can find Natalie and her other book, The Creativity Leap, which was also great. And we talked about in the past. And her book is coming out next week. And she won't probably say it, but I will say it. For authors, it makes such a difference to get the book early and review the book early, which I need to go do mine. If you can review, if you get the book and you can even read the chapter on rest or any of the chapters and put a comment on Goodreads or Amazon in the first few days, it really makes a difference. It
Yes.
affects where you come up in search results when people, it affects how you get featured by algorithms. So if you ever really want to support an author, in addition to buying early, it's getting those reviews. And again, if it's a 4 or 5 star review, preferably five, if you want to help an author and you don't feel you can honestly give them that, then just take a pass. You don't have to give your 1, 2, or 3 star review. You can just skip it. But I'm going to go leave my 5 star review as soon as we hang up so I do not forget. And thank you so much, Natalie. It's just been great talking to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.